So this is my commentary and reflection on chapter 28 of the Proverbs. I finished last time with verse 9. I'll continue now with verse 10. Whoso causes the righteous to go astray in an evil way, he shall find himself into his own pit, but the upright shall have good things in possession. So where to begin? The beginnings are about finding a headspace, about giving up that selfish conception, reducing one's self-importance, coming into the experience with a certain sense of openness, discernment, desire to know, and there's nothing like, perhaps this is just a personal thing, but there's nothing like the modern day, or maybe I should say the working day, to remove the mind from that faithful disposition, or at the very least the state of mind that is somber, that it can afford a certain type of attention, that it is not bound by some principality, that it must serve it. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that the mind is completely chained in the modern day, but there is a disconnect, surely, in that environment, in the common working environment, and that of our sacred places, our faithful experiences. And perhaps for a good reason. I don't want to get too far into the weeds. Whoso causes the righteous to go astray in an evil way. So let's talk a little bit about the righteous. This experience, life, certain pursuits can involve this coming closer to righteousness. There's an idea that there is a true sense of righteousness, independent of the self. It is something always there to be had, something that is secure, principled, reliable. It is a type of ontology that one can possess, a type of being. Despite the unknowns that are brought to us throughout life, despite the perceived difficulties that we may have maintaining a certain sense of being or presence in environments that seem hostile to it, and despite not exactly knowing in every situation what the right answer is, something that characterizes the righteous person is the desire or the will to do good. It is the desire to not only do good, but understand what good is, what leads to good outcomes. There's a moral aspect to this. There's an aspect of law, of justice, of the various virtues. And I think at times the frustrating part about going through the exercise of defining justice or defining righteousness or defining the good is that it is not simple. Every time we find an example in life, we may be faced with another that seems unclear. But the process of coming to know something, coming to understand something, is a relative constant, I think. Maybe that's a contradiction in terms. It is a constant. And so what I'd like to try to do is find some of these pillars, while they may not necessarily be a pillar of righteousness in the absolute sense, it would be a pillar to guide our mind in the pursuit of that righteousness. Now, the antidote to all evil, as I've said, is the process, it is the procedure, it is the symbol of creation. And creation is no simple matter. It involves production of fundamental elements. It involves consolidation of information. It involves various levels of purpose and of meaning. To a conscious agent, it involves a layer that is seemingly non-purposeful, non-meaningful, until the intervention of said agent. But of course, in the context of nothing, in the face of nothing, something quite simple, the most basic material, I think, can be seen as magnificent, sophisticated, purposeful. But that matter of scale disrupts the perception of mind. This reminds me of a video that I was watching the other day, quite a fascinating video. It can be applied, I think, to many different types of images, but there was I'm not sure what type of device was used to capture this image, but it was very zoomed in. And there was this character, I believe it was a Japanese character or something, that was written. And the viewer at the outset of the video doesn't really know what they are looking at, just this inscription. Then there is a zoom out, followed by another zoom out, and this continual successive zooming out. Eventually it becomes clear what they are looking at, and it is a computer chip. And the character, or the symbol that is etched into this computer chip is so small that the device that was necessary to create it must have been magnificently small and magnificently precise in order to do such a thing. I think just a broader reflection on the acceleration and the nature of computation of computer chips these days is something of a marvel, contemporary marvel. But I say this to emphasize perspective. And in the context of creation, this perspective, I think, is important. It's important because out of all of these steps, eventually some conscious agent becomes such that it is aware, and it undergoes the process that I'm going through right now. It finds itself in a body and in a mental experience, not quite understanding why it is here, what its purpose is. And yet, it is driven, it is committed to finding something that would satisfy not only the mind, but satisfy its purpose, to satisfy a way of being, let's say. And while, from the perspective of the agent, that base material may seem as simple as the etching on that computer chip, I think it is as magnificent. And by the same token, I myself, that's the conscious agent, may be that small symbolic etching into this much broader universe, reality, whatever we would call it. And from the perspective of some other agent, the existence of such a thing on so small a scale would be magnificent. Now, in what way does this necessarily assist us in understanding righteousness? Well, at the outset I mentioned that I wish to find these principles for which we can confidently return to. And I don't necessarily think that reflecting on perspective will be the thing that forms such a principle towards righteousness. It does begin to shape a sense of mind, though, and I think it is moving us in the right direction. Creation is much more than just perspective, I think. I mentioned consolidation of information, of something simple being involved in the creative process of something much more complex. This undulating process of producing order from disorder, and within some ordered state, a newfound sense of disorder. And again, here I wish to invoke this matter of perspective. And certainly in the material sense, as this relationship, this dance between different particles and elements, and eventually systems and beings. Throughout the process of creating identities, there certainly is this way of decreasing entropy, but while somehow at the same time increasing it, only to find it at a more of an intimate scale or perspective, a zoomed-in scale, to continue through this process of consolidation and then of openness of the human mind, we can say, of something so small in a material context, but so powerful in its capacity and in its reach. And in this way, we find small material capable of something quite chaotic. But the pursuit of faithfulness and of righteousness is the step for that agent to find further consolidation, to further the project of creation. But what we consolidate, what we bring information onto or into, is something that is sustainable, something that doesn't reduce the agency of man to nothingness. That sort of thing would be going astray in an evil way, the willful desire to destroy, and the tendency towards complete absence. Whoso causes the righteous to go astray in an evil way, he shall fall himself into his own pit. So what does it mean for somebody to fall into a pit? One's own pit. If I think about a pit and I think about falling into it in a material context, it's something that could be quite injurious, something that is deep. But materially, we only get so far. Symbolically, this pit and the depth therein, I think it implies a sense of being covered in darkness, lost, unable to see. That aspect of creation has not been allowed to unfold in the mind, such that the light is separated from darkness, such that discernment is possible, and that there is this sort of closed-off, selfish, mental existence in a void, just chaotic potential and no capacity to actually produce and to create. A depressed mind, in a sense. Depressed in the sense that it is put down, forced down, unable to fulfill any purpose. But the upright shall have good things in possession. So in this context, we can imagine something good as the opposite of falling into that pit, of being able to discern, being able to see, being able to fulfill one's purpose. The rich man is wise in his own conceit, but the poor that has understanding searches him out. So today is a new day, and my apologies for the rapid turnover between that last verse and this one. It may seem like an abrupt shift, but I felt that the majority of the work that was done on the first half of the previous verse made that second half go by much quicker. The necessity of exploring it was a bit less. Of course, there's always something to be said, always different roads to be explored. But for now, we will move on to this verse, this new verse. The rich man is wise in his own conceit, but the poor that has understanding searches him out. So in the first half of this, the rich man is wise in his own conceit. Starting with this word conceit, there's a prideful element to it. Conceit, meaning that there is this excessive sense of self-satisfaction or worth, self-importance. In fact, the Google definition is excessive pride in oneself. And pride itself is a strong emotion towards, or a strong satisfaction of one's own achievements. And that's something that can be also attributed to another. We can have pride in other things and things outside of ourselves. But conceit is that excessive pride. Now, the rich man can be thought of in any number of ways. When we say something is rich, or a rich person, usually what we are referring to is that material wealth. And I don't think we would be wrong to stick with that reference. There are ways in which a man can be rich for which this verse probably would not apply. If this rich man is rich in righteousness or wisdom, outside of his own conceit, then of course it probably wouldn't make very much sense. But just as much as having a great deal of money or assets, the quality of being wealthy, we could just as easily define rich as plentiful and abundant. So outside of the obvious areas where, in a sense of plentiful or abundance, that type of richness would not allow us to logically follow the verse, I would like to expand the mind and allow it to consider a man that just may have enough, more than enough perhaps in some situations, a sense of lavishness. It could be, I'm thinking about an environment for which one was raised, an environment that they were provided for everything. They had the social support, they had the material support. A person perhaps that was naturally gifted. I think about the tortoise and the hare illustration example, in which the hare is naturally gifted in speed, whereas the tortoise is not, but the tortoise is disciplined and he continues on his way. Where the hare believes that he has time to take a nap during the race, when they are racing, and of course the hare sleeps so long that the tortoise ends up passing and winning the race. To put in other words, I would like to approach this using the definition, assuming logical coherence, of plentifulness and of abundance, such that this overflowing of something is the very thing, the plentifulness is the very thing that gets in the way of wisdom. And the thing, the mechanism, that mental mechanism, is that the self, which I think is important to describe, the self is inflated. It is inflated to a degree that it is shut off from the possibility of being aware of their missteps, of their true orientation to things. Another thought that I think might serve as a stepping stone is that when we consider something such as wisdom, and we consider how it is that one can come to be considered wise, about the hours and the discipline that it takes in order to satisfy such a requirement of a particular topic for which a person is considered wise, we think about somebody that understands the landscape, a person that understands the relationships more specifically, and how to produce relationships such that a certain outcome or a certain orientation, a certain series of relationships must be in order for something to be true or accurate, whatever. And this can be applied to anything, I think. There's a sense of judiciousness here. There's a sense of true understanding, of making effective decisions. And it's a strange thing, almost a contradiction in terms, to say that somebody is wise in their conceit. I don't believe that it is, because, as I've mentioned, the self can be something that serves as a blinder, and we can be quite proficient at understanding the self's desires, understanding the ego understanding our inward orientation, such that our attention spent here blinds us to the rest of the world, the rest of the environment. Whereas, in the broad sense, wisdom would allow us to see more of the environment, to participate more effectively in our day-to-day interactions. Wisdom, in the narrow sense, facilitates further blindness. As a matter of experience, I find it fascinating, frustrating at times, challenging always, at the fuel of that existence, the thing that propels us forward, the faith that we have, the direction of our attention, what we find to be valuable, what we consider to be just and right. They say that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, the beginning of knowledge. Because one ought to be afraid about getting that orientation incorrect. For getting that orientation incorrect, as we see here, or as it is suggested, is something that would not lead us to what we believed to be led to in the first place. Instead of righteousness, we gain foolishness. Instead of wisdom, we gain ignorance. And so this matter of conceit, excessive pride, excessive satisfaction in one's own achievements, there's a period of my life that I think there are so many interrelated factors of being, and when one does not reflect on them, but at some point in life becomes aware of them, there are many different points, there are many different knots that need to be untied, broken surfaces that need to be repaired. And I go back to thinking about this ego, and the selfish enterprise, and the powerful will and the belief that the individual is the highest form of agency. Not that the individual is not important, but there is a sense in youth and in perhaps culturally in certain dispositions for which there's an unhealthy balance that the individual and the autonomy perceived therein is given. This unfortunate balance that, again, it's about orientation to life, it's about orientation to others, to other people. It is the very beginning of thought. It is the beginning of that wedding between our feelings and our logical, thought-based development, or production, I should say, of the mind. And such a strange thing it is that the self and this capacity to integrate this whole experience, how man experiences it, with our feelings and our logical portions, the things that we are given in childhood, the subtleties of mind for which most of the time we do not experience. I had another experience relatively recently I saw a group of people that I haven't seen in over 13 years, and the memories that were brought back that I forgot about, and yet I had them, certainly to a lesser degree, perhaps when I knew them more intimately, but the point being, the mind is such a strange and large system that it may keep things from that self that perceives itself to be so much in charge. Excessive satisfaction in one's achievements. I think in the end this comes down to something quite simple. It is the allocation of resources, of mental resources, of attention. If we spend our time thinking about being satisfied at what was done or what it took to achieve something, the less we are spending time on doing things of a similar magnitude. Of course, this is not the only thing that's important here. The belief that the self has moved in a place that is maybe superior to another, morally speaking, because of an achievement. The belief that now, because of this achievement, that there is a certain moral standing, that the universe is now in deficit. It is the debtor to our creditor. We have this view of reality that now the self is the center and everything else revolves around it. Inherently blinding. The rich man is wise in his own conceit, but the poor that has understanding searches him out. The poor that has understanding. By experience, hardship, suffering, burden affords a certain productive environment. I think burdens can just as easily lead to a type of conceit, such that the self feels like it is a victim. It victimizes itself. It tells itself that the burdens are unjust, that they are owed something by the universe just as much as the rich person does. And by this they find themselves in an unfortunate situation, with alcohol perhaps, or an aggressive temper. But in this situation we are not talking about that. We're talking about the poor that has understanding, the ones who have taken the difficulties, the burdens, and have learned from them, learned how to bear them, learned how to be productive despite limitations relative to others, learned how to accept their failures, even at a low estate, learned to accept that they are not as important as they would like to be, or perhaps that they think they once were. There's a certain learning of humility. The humility of the poor, such a good experience to learn from. And I think about my own experience. I think about today and the way that I approached certain problems, and the way in which I may have felt adverse to something that I probably should not have. And I'll share an example. I was speaking to a coworker, and I asked for advice. Now, this bit of advice that I was given I didn't understand, and in fact I felt that there was something incorrect about what was said. And it had nothing to do with whether or not, my response rather, had nothing to do with whether or not this piece of advice was correct. It was my, I can say perhaps conceit, in a way, or pride. It was a type of satisfaction in a particular type of achievement. The achievement in this sense would have been knowledge. That knowledge was the thing that was in my mind saying that this advice is incorrect. Now that in and of itself there's nothing wrong with that. That's an important part about coming to understand that which is true. But the inclination and the response to approach this in good faith, I think, was poor. It was not necessarily poor because of my behavior. It was poor because of my thoughts. It was poor because the only thing that I could focus on was saying that this person was incorrect. And I didn't really explicitly say this to myself at the time, probably because I was trying to protect the rich man, in the sense, the rich man that was wise in his conceit. Rich in the sense that there is this perceived sense of knowledge, of knowing better. And because of that, the advice that was given was not an opportunity to explore and perhaps to discover something new or to refute something, which are both productive exercises. But in both of these situations, it's not possible to continue under that guise of false attention, not listening to what is being said. And if I think about it farther, there was this aspect of myself, that faithful aspect, that was thinking about, well, how could this be possible given this situation? And it was working through the issues. But it was not enough where the desire was placed in that sense of discovery. And I really have to think about exactly where it is, and I want to say that it was within the self somewhere, and that's probably accurate. Or it was within the belief, again, in perceived knowledge, the perceived abundance therein. And so I suppose that the knowledge, the memory, the way that information is stored was the thing that was placed on a high pedestal. And because it was here, because it was so high, relative to the other things that I was attending to in the moment, the other things on a lower pedestal were sacrificed. And that interaction, while not necessarily bad from an outward-facing view, I think, was not as good as it could have been. It could have been a much better and more productive experience. The poor that has understanding searches him out. So there are a few different roads that we can go down here. Now, given that I'm on a particular trajectory, I think we should stick with it. But I recognize the potential that we can think about this in terms of the individual we can think about it also relationally between more than one person. But in the sense that we can think about this in the individual, when we think symbolically, spiritually, that this rich man is the element of disgust. This is the thing that we want to avoid. This is what we want to excise from our experience so that we don't fall into the blindness that is the product of conceit. And for me, the first step at searching him out is to recognize that this rich man, his existence is subtle. It is interwoven in me. As I mentioned earlier, this point where emotion meets reason, it's so soon in the production of thought that I think even before the internal judge, before this information meets the internal judge, it has room to grow, to proliferate. And at that stage, if the judge is weak, or if the judge is too far downstream, such that this environment can be made to such a degree that it is uncontrollable, perhaps that's not a good way to think about it, but whatever the situation is, and I'll explore this in a moment, the sudden speed for which this rich man and his strong belief in his own conceit, the power that it has, the drive, seems to give it the force of reason and of logic and of goodness itself. And so perhaps when I think about this situation as I find it, it's a matter of the discerning judge rather than it is about the exact moment that it is caught. But certainly if it is caught sooner and the judge is discerning, the more controllable it is. There's another reflection with this regard that I think is important as it relates to my mind in particular. I find the necessity for a certain type of balance in my interactions with people, that from my perspective, finding this discerning judge, finding the poor that has understanding, takes time. And sometimes that time that it takes me, perhaps because of my lack of fitness in this respect, is insufficient to hold the attention of another, except if it is somebody that is well known to me, somebody that sort of understands my mind. And oftentimes there's not enough time to deliberate and come to a sensible conclusion. Sometimes it is because of the fatigue of mind that leads to that situation. And the sifting through all of that weight to find some clarity of thought, to find the poor buried underneath that drudgery of inattentiveness. I find that that can also be a limiter, and that this rich man, wise in conceit, often is not necessarily burdened by the fluff of inattention. And perhaps that is a reflection on my state as a man, that I need to grow, that it should be reversed, that it should be the man of conceit, of the rich man of conceit, that should be buried rather than the poor man that needs to be found and facilitated. Now, to bring this verse to a close, there's one last area that I've thought of here, and that has to do with relationships, strong relationships. I'm thinking about familial relationships. I'm thinking about two particular examples. One of them I'm considering a friend of mine in his relationship to his brother. Another is myself and my relationship to my father. Now, out of all relationships, I think that there is plenty of room to improve. And I think that there are areas that in life that we ought to recognize certain fundamental relationships. And barring some quite unfortunate situation for which I am not involved in, the relationship that I have with my father, for example, is something that is malleable. It is not poor in a sense. Maybe there's poor elements, but it is not something that is broken beyond repair. Likewise, my friend in his relationship to his brother, it's something that has poor elements to it, but it is not something that is broken beyond repair. And in fact, he, in his relationship, or his desire in that relationship, is to connect with his brother on a deeper level than he currently does. And I think about these relationships, and I think about this verse. The rich man is wise in his own conceit. The rich man can think that he is strong in his relationship. Perhaps he thinks that the only relationship that he really needs is to himself, so he doesn't talk to his family, doesn't talk to his brother, doesn't talk to his father the way that he should. It doesn't share the information, doesn't connect. But the poor that has understanding searches him out, finds the reason why there is this block. If there is desire to establish the relationship, then that desire ought to be placed at that point of attention. There's a lot to be sacrificed in relationship building. And as I reflect on my friend's experience, I've given him advice for certain things. Advice that I think was well-intentioned and perhaps had some positive benefit, but at the same time, I understand that of my comparative relationship to my father, that's kind of reflective of his relationship to his brother. I understood that I was not following the advice that I had given him, myself, in my relationships. And in this way, I feel like I can see the rich man. I could see the poor man finding himself in a state of humility and recognizing that if this is the advice that you're giving, this is something that you believe at some level. This is something that you ought to implement to truly believe it. When righteous men do rejoice, there is great glory, but when the wicked rise, a man is hidden. So today is a new day, new thoughts. It happens to be a Thursday today, a Thursday evening after work. Out of the countless times that I've started a new episode, it's always the same sort of experience. The mind needs time to warm up. There needs to be this process of orienting towards self-reflection, opening up the mind to be as honest and forthcoming as possible. And it ought not to be difficult, but sometimes in the more passive states of mind, that provocation towards action can be a bit difficult. It's starting up an engine that hasn't been run for a while, or perhaps it's been running for a while and it's overheated. whatever the case might be, I found myself reflecting about what I was saying yesterday, about my failure to attend to what somebody else was saying, the content of what they're saying, and the sacrifice of the self in order to understand more fully and to use that sacrifice as a way to maximize engagement, information transfer between myself and my coworker. Today, I think the experience was a little bit better. Of course, there are many things that come to mind that could have been done differently. But for today, given a relatively peaceful day, in terms of that internal judge that wishes to pick apart every little thing that had gone wrong, I would like to get into this verse. When righteous men do rejoice, there is great glory, but when the wicked rise, a man is hidden. So the first thing to do here, the first place that I would like to start, is with this word rejoice. So beginning with the Old French, we have a meaning that is to be glad, to take delight, to enjoy oneself. The Old French is derived from the prefix re, meaning again or thoroughly, and joir, meaning to be glad or to enjoy. Now just to pause here for a moment, what I'm thinking about is two words that are somewhat related: pride and conceit. Pride is satisfaction in one's own achievements or the achievements of another. It is not just a purely selfish thing. Conceit is that excessive pride. Conceit is almost always seen as a negative. And then at the root of this, although not completely the same, it is almost of the same dimension. And that is this production of the heart, a thoroughly joyful experience. When we think of enjoying something, I think we can also say that we are satisfied with something. And I don't mean to say that I think that these words are the same. They are different words, they have slightly different meanings. But in the sense that they share this dimension, they share this satisfaction of heart. I think where they differ is where they point to, the directionality of it. Pride, I've had this exercise before, is an interesting word, and I think that often we say something that is not technically correct, that pride becomes before the fall. But it is a haughty spirit that comes before the fall, and pride goes before destruction. And without denying the dangers that are associated with pride, I think there's a distinction that we have to make. There's a contextual sophistication for which satisfaction in one's achievements or the achievements of another may not necessarily lead to the destruction of ourselves or our morality. Again, this is very contextual, because the probability for pride to interfere with one's perception of goodness is quite high. But what we may see destroyed through a certain type of satisfaction, again, in a certain direction, may be that aspect of ourselves that was before limiting us. It was something that before an experience of an achievement, let's say, the individual, the mind, had not committed to such an endeavor to achieve. Now, this is a bit of a stretch. Again, it's contextual. But such an accomplishment and the satisfaction therein, if it is a good and if it is a righteous achievement, then there's a way in which the heart ought to be a part of the process of feeling enjoyed. Now, I'll leave that aside for the moment. And I'll mention just briefly that conceit is this excessive pride. And that word, I think, exists for a reason. The emphasis on the excess. That it is always negative. That one would be hard-pressed to find some contextual example, no matter how small, to prove that excessive pride is not a negative thing. If we return to our word that we are concerned with here, rejoice, going to the Latin roots, the French J-O-I-R, again that suffix, I believe, or the word, to be glad, to enjoy, is traced back to a Latin verb, G-A-U-D-E-R-E, meaning to rejoice or to take pleasure in. It is also the source of words like joy, gaudy, reflecting happiness or celebration. From Proto-Indo-European, we have a term that conveys feelings of pleasure, delight, again, rejoicing. In the 14th century, rejoicin', in Middle English, meant to feel or express great joy. And here, I think, comes around this idea of pride. Great joy, great happiness. Much like pride, there may be an indication or a suggestion that it is oriented to the self. But I believe that the true definition of pride can also include something outside of the self. And so here, at least what it seems to me, is that we are considering something that is more broad. That to enjoy, to be glad, but most importantly, I think, given the root of this, to feel happiness, to feel joy, to feel great happiness, pleasure. This experience, this type of being, is where our attention ought to be. And we have the context of when righteous men do rejoice. I think we can say when wicked men do rejoice, when evil men do rejoice, this would still be something that would make sense to us. Most of us would think that in this situation, the rejoicing, the joy, and the delight is found within something negative, something profoundly destructive. And we could find within there those elements of pride and certainly conceit. So let's take an example here. let's say, in my experience, I witness a coworker, maybe that I am not the most fond of, struggling in a certain situation. I think the almost natural response, given the orientation to this person, would to feel a type of malaligned rejoicing, delight, pleasure in the difficult experience that this coworker is having. And in this way, we would not plug in the word righteous. We would plug in the word wicked or foolish, perhaps. And the reason is that this joy or pleasure is not found within something that is good. A struggling coworker is not something that benefits us. In fact, to our ends, it probably is destructive. It's destructive to the team environment. It's destructive to the morale of that individual. And it facilitates further divide if one is to rejoice in the suffering of a co-worker. So I will say that today is a new day, but I don't wish to spend too much time here in reflection to warm my mind up. I think I am interested in discovering something. Now, to refresh the memory, I was talking about rejoicing. I was talking about the way in which this rejoicing can be variable in the context of man, given what he finds to be valuable, what he takes pleasure in, what he takes delight from. I found this interesting relationship between rejoicing and pride, how similar they are. But of course, this verse is not prompting us to consider the arbitrary nature of perception at times. It is asking us to think about the right direction of this rejoicing, of this happiness, pleasure, this delight. And it's for righteous men in this experience that we consider it. And the term righteous, something that comes up all too often in the Proverbs, a term that I have been now formulating more and more to be a term that is aligned with the principles of creation. There's a lot that goes into that, and I think I'm still formulating it. But there's something to do with the consolidation of information. It doesn't deny its separation. It doesn't deny its disunification at times. But for conscious experience to exist, it must have this element of coming together into oneness, to hold that possibility for difference. And then again, that difference is reconsolidated again. At least it would appear so in man. Man comes from this non-consolidated matter. We can think of it both just in terms of raw information, but also in terms of purposeful, meaningful, directed life up through the evolution to man. But once man has found himself aware, self-reflecting, I want to say agentic, but just considering the previous iterations of man or his other organisms, other species, under that common heading or common ancestry, for which he had a few cousins, or for which we had a few cousins in our inception that we lived alongside with. Mentioning that just because man is something that came to be over time. It is something that went through this process. And it's important to distinguish that because man's mind, as it is perceived, as it is filtered through the subject, as I speak through myself now, as I have all of my memories, all of my feelings, all of my desires, all of the ways in which I am wrong about the world and the few for which I am correct about it, I speak into this microphone. I am this agent. And as I think back on this trend, this tendency towards this interrelatedness between that dispersive material and then the unified, the dispersive and then the unified, but altogether among the transitions, these sort of phase transitions of material, not literally a phase, but it transitioned the boundaries between the unconsolidated and the consolidated. If drawn out, I think, at least in our case, it is certainly the case that we have an experience of unconsolidated matter finding itself consolidated in non-purposeful matter, planets, of various elements and these sorts of things, and then eventually life is born through some miracle, through some magic combination, through some highly improbable combination of material that is this fundamental consolidation, the beginning of life as we know it, and then the explosion of potential that is afforded by that unification. And then again, that information comes to, and material comes to a point in the evolution of man, and we find ourselves at this new precipice of unification, certainly only to be expanded again in this proliferation of consciousness into something different. Man will still be man, as life is life, as material is material, but there will be this next thing involving mind. Artificial intelligence, no doubt, will play a role in that. But I say all of this to say that the righteous person is a part of this experience. Now, this is more of a top-down view outside of the subject. The reason that I brought up my own subjective experience, reflecting on the fact that I am here and talking into this microphone, means that I participate with this process in a particular way. And I don't necessarily think, well, maybe I should be careful. I think there are plenty of elements that I can add here to make this a little bit prettier than just basic unconsolidation to consolidation to something that is unconsolidated again. I think with each iterative step, with each undulation, we find a potential that we didn't find before, an opening of a certain new set of probabilities. And I find that within our experience, the matters which we concern ourselves with most, the feelings and emotions that we most highly value, are constantly interacting and engaging with the introductory process. Now, I began, speaking of the beginning, as unconsolidated matter. But of course, there was a consolidator, as there always has been. And it is difficult to say exactly how the divine thread finds its way to man. Or maybe I should say, it's difficult to say how man's mind finds the divine thread. And what I mean by that is, it's quite simple or quite easy to imagine objective things, although it takes work, of course, to understand and define the material world, of which I don't pretend to have embarked on any serious endeavor. But that aside, the important aspect of this, I think, is that even in the lack of an extremely firm understanding of material causality, the general belief in its existence is enough. And that is a piece in a broader game that the mind can play to understand where its spark came from. But this righteousness, it is, as I have defined, as being built on these pillars of creation, involving what I've said about these patterns, about the influence of something that we cannot see, totally as I can see the pen in front of me. But somehow we can perceive it. We can perceive it by the very fact of our experience, of being conscious, of thinking about it. And such a delicate balance it is, given all of the unfortunate circumstances of our environment, and how wrong things can go, how brutal nature can be. What a perspective that it affords us. I find righteousness to be a difficult thing. I wish to trace it back, almost as if I'm a fish caught on a hook. I wish to know exactly what pulls me. I would like to be closer to it. I'd like to be safe from that potential that wishes to do me harm but offers me a similar sort of yearning, such that I am tempted by its pull. But my very search for that thing that would give me peace is disrupted by this tyrant, some demon that has been born long ago. But despite the negative feelings, surely I think it could be said that there are plenty of positives. And instead of the tyrant, there is the Savior. There are the ones who help us along. And there is the thread that goes through them as well. Even this modern bureaucratic machine has a thread that goes through it. They say that righteousness is not merely about following moral laws, but about being rightly related to God, living in alignment with His will, participating in that ontology, and continually being transformed by that grace. How intricate a thing, how intricate a fiber or thread to penetrate us so deeply. All the while, the question is always, what is God? How do I know His will? How do I know that I am actually on the righteous path and not just on the contrary, which we spoke of before as that possibility for which a wicked person can rejoice in what they feel to be good? But in fact, it is a negative for themselves and for those around them. And so by way of understanding, we follow our experiences. We take heed at precedent. We adhere to the covenant, the law, and the commandments. We do so earnestly with a humble heart. Unity in Christ gives us many of these pillars for which we can orient ourselves, to transform ourselves. It is that next stepping stone, much as I've conceptualized the stepping stone from base material in the beginning to be consolidated into material for which something else can be built upon it. And upon that material, life is born. Upon that life, the various types of life, and eventually the types of life that involve a type of mind that seems to be a bit different from the rest. And by that mind, it is not necessarily that the material organism must evolve in order to survive. It is more that his mind must transform, such that he can survive. That mechanism for which he taps into the divine thread is strong in his class of being. And who knows exactly how many figures this will take, how many of them that we will miss when they are here, for this mind of man to be transformed. It seems like Christ was on a different scale. We consider him to be our God, after all. But here we are again, back to the individual and the individual's experience. And for my own sake, I feel this transformative process at my doorstep. I feel it within me, beyond the doorstep. But the way in which I feel it at the doorstep, for which it has not crossed that barrier, is the degree to which it is accepted, the degree to which I participate in it. Some of that I feel as though I am ignorant of, and the part of the process of faith and coming to know God is to undergo that process for which we figure out how to let it into ourselves. And it seems simple just to let it in. It's almost as if the very wanting to know limits us, limits me from just accepting. The rational mind, a bit of a problem in the contemporary era. In the words of St. John Chrysostom, righteousness is not in mere words, but in deeds of love, for faith without work is dead. From St. Basil the Great, a righteous life is one that seeks not its own, but considers the needs of others first. In the words of St. Gregory of Nyssa, true righteousness is the soul's movement towards the infinite goodness of God. From Saint Seraphim of Sarov, acquire the spirit of peace, and thousands around you will be saved. So today is a new day, new thoughts. When righteous men do rejoice, there is great glory. But when the wicked rise, a man is hidden. This second part of the verse is the one that interests me the most, I think. I'm always excited to go through the exercise of defining righteousness and going through that procedure as we went through in the first half, but there's something about this reference, a man being hidden, that I find fascinating. But when the wicked rise, a man is hidden. So going off of previous ideas of the wicked person, there's this element of witchcraft involved in the rootedness of that definition. Now, given that the mind is a large place, given that we are agents in this broader conscious experience, witchcraft, to me, is something that is subtle. It is something that adheres to the laws that bind all of us. It is not something that is entirely fantastical, as we may portray it in popular culture. But it is something that is quite powerful, that of the deceptive intellect, tempting one into a road of submission or to a road of absence. The wicked person, I think, can be seen as somebody that is either profoundly troubled or somebody that is sociopathic, psychopathic. Now, when I think of this word rise, I think of all of the various ways in which we can imagine a wicked person coming to a position of influence. We can think about this collectively, of course, as some of the principal institutions in a society may fall to this unfortunate disposition. We can think about it just in terms of an individual, that the wickedness within the individual arises and perverts, tempts the mind into behaviors that are contrary to righteousness. That instead of facilitating this love and care through their behaviors are directed towards selfish gain, towards manipulation. A man is hidden. So I wonder about the way to conceptualize this. In what way are we referring to, or is the verse referring to, the man? It seems as though the implication is that there is this great potential wound up in man, and that it is because of these forces of wickedness, of evil, and of foolishness that pervert his attention, that perpetually distract him, that causes him to move away from God. But the important thing is what he moves away from behaviorally, or what he moves towards behaviorally. For this is how I think we can truly gauge his relationship to that divine spark of goodness. For a man to be hidden, I think about the conscious domain, I think about my own experience, I think about the vastness of potential thought, I see a darkened environment. I used to use the analogy often of being in a freshly cut or freshly harvested cornfield. Underneath a long pole atop which is a singular bulb, a street lamp. And of course, underneath the street lamp, we are illuminated, but everything else around us is obscured. We cannot see it. And it is those forces that lurk on the boundary that wish to tempt us and deceive us, because we can barely see or make out exactly what it is that is calling us. And there is great risk, I think, in mind for not being prudent, and perhaps not waiting until one understands where they should step to make sure that that environment is clear from ruin, potential ruin. But I think when a man falls into this wickedness or evil, he finds himself dragged into this pit of darkness, that pit of Sheol, and he becomes hidden, not only to himself, but also that light for which intelligibility permeates, for which he is able to understand goodness and love. And forever he's destined to this unfortunate drudgery of an experience, perpetually bound by his most superficial desires. He remains hidden from God, in a way. He that covers his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesses and forsakes them shall have mercy. So the first part of this verse, it would be hard-pressed to find a person that cannot relate to it. If we are engaged in any measure to try and be better and to move towards righteousness, we will undoubtedly have come to that situation. We may confront something for which we know that our behavior is unacceptable to a degree, but we give ourselves an excuse. We cover our sins with promises of a tomorrow that is liberated from such constraints. We say to ourselves that it is not so bad, that it could be worse, or it has been worse. The reasoning of an addict, surely. But the thing I've found about sin, aside from the subtlety at which it can creep in, and how quickly it can snowball into something entirely unproductive and against all prior desires, is that it is something I think that continually needs to be fought against. It is something that needs to be prepared for. It is an aspect of our experience that requires reflection. It requires modification. There are no circumstances, I think, in life that don't involve this potential for sin to find us, or for temptation. And there are many ways I think that we can go astray, find ourselves not in alignment with that divine spark. For my own part, there are many things, well, there are a few things maybe, I should say, in my life that I know that I should change. And the reflection on why they remain the same, I think is interesting. It is the aspect of self that doesn't, as I've mentioned before, it doesn't accept very readily. Perhaps it doesn't believe. Perhaps it is just a selfish holding. It is like an adolescent that wishes to be with his or her mother for that comfort. But that comfort is not the thing that'll save it, of course. It is that striving and the accepting of what it must do, the burdens it must take on. The call that it must hear. He that covers his sins shall not prosper. But whoso confesses and forsakes them shall have mercy. Now, surely this is easier said than done. Confession and forsaking. There's a level of honesty, a level of, again, self-reflection, a moment of true conviction that while in some aspects of life are common and others completely absent, the divide between the two I always find interesting. That in one context, in one case it is readily understood, whereas in another it is totally abandoned and foreign. But as far and as much as I consider it now, as much as my mind is able to muster this strength and that desire to be good and to live that life that, although may be burdened by the desire for absence, for some relief somehow, the pressure that builds within the mind, it is for the mind to find productive solutions, productive outlets, rather than to fall into sin, whatever it might be. Happy is the man that fears always, but he that hardens his heart shall fall into mischief. So let's examine the ways in which this can be true and the ways that it may not be. So surely the man that is looking out for the law, the one that wishes not to be guilty when judged, the man that wishes to do good is surely the man that will find goodness. There is a way, I think, however, the possibility of this man fearing to an excessive degree, putting these boundaries and limitations on experience, shackling the mind to yet another unfortunate type of servitude. A difficult balance, surely. But among this experience, balance is a part of the process. of figuring out exactly what the mind can handle at any given time, of setting goals, and of meeting objectives. But he that hardens his heart shall fall into mischief. I think about the heart. I think about this seat of our feelings and our desires. That industrial factory that produces so much of our experience. So much that is fundamental to us, our emotions. To have a heart that is hardened is, I think, to produce a certain type of emotion only. It'd be difficult for man to go through experience without emotion. But it's understandable if a man is to find himself having undergone an unfortunate series of events in which the only buyers of the product of the heart are those that wish to feel or that have a particular disposition towards the darker side of life, that those righteous consumers of love and of joy no longer find solace in that mind. Perhaps after going through these experiences, all that is left is that burnt out old building that is only able to produce a few emotions that are not sufficient to sustain a good outlook on life, a positive disposition, or a general desire to be productive. There are many ways in which we can examine how the heart can fail, or how the broader agent, including that heart, may change, such that the experience of that heart, the emotions that are produced, leads to some bad outcome. Now there's a particular direction that this verse is prompting us to consider. Happy is the man that fears always, but he that hardens his heart shall fall into mischief. So it is the agent. Out of our potential scenarios, it is the agent that is the one that is willfully stamping down the heart, hardening it. Now for the moment, I'd like to spend some time thinking about exactly how we can square this adjective of hardening of the heart, which is such a richly symbolic term, and how that might relate to us experientially, subjectively. When I think about something that is hard, I think about something that is relatively immovable, that if I press into it, that it will not give way, that it is rigid, not easily disrupted. Now, to take this sort of thing and to apply it to the heart is not immediately intelligible in my mind. There have been a few different descriptions that I've used to describe the heart. The more superficial one has been that of the industrial factory, which at the surface I think seems to be a bit dystopian in nature, sort of a tongue-in-cheek description, perhaps, a contemporary description of the heart. But I don't mean it in a basic sense that the heart is restricted to this type of drudgery or this dulled type of experience. What I mean is that this factory has the potential to produce many things. It can produce meaningless things. It can produce quite useful and purposeful things. And given that the economy of mind runs on the outputs of our industriousness, our sort of intrinsic industriousness, the way that we attend to things, the way that we feel about things, it is quite important, this factory of the heart, and the supply that it produces. But there's another way in which I have described it, and that has to do with the pillars of creation, the 7 days of creation, each one of them having a particular role in supporting the identity of the heart. And that particularly comes from a verse that prompts us specifically to think about that. I'm trying to find it here. I'll try to find it quickly. I believe it comes from chapter 26. In verse 24 and 25, since they are related, I'll read it here. He that hates disassembles with his lips, and lays up deceit within him. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. So such a strange thing to reference. There are 7 abominations in his heart. This is not the only time that we've seen a verse like that referred to the number 7. And actually, I believe it came from the same chapter, if not the chapter before. I probably won't be able to find it offhand here. But nonetheless, it has been referred to before in the Proverbs. What I find fascinating about that is that I suppose we can find a few different references to the number 7. We could think of it as an arbitrary distinction, or we could use it as a productive opportunity to think of the heart, and in that case, the inversion of the heart, what the 7 principles of that identity actually are. And I don't think that there's much more of a productive exercise than to try and understand it through the pillars of creation. And going through that exercise was quite productive. It was difficult. It is by no way exhaustive, by no means exhaustive. But it gave me, at the time, a particular perspective about the heart and about the way that I choose to facilitate it, to nurture it, to have it grow. And given that creation, the narrative of creation is such a large event, it includes so much, it is difficult at the outset to completely grasp what that might mean if one is to translate those pillars to the heart. But in a general sense, what I find is that the heart, I should be careful, judicious with my language, that the heart is a tool. It is an aspect of mine in itself, of those principles. It is a part of a broader system, the system of mind. The heart is only one of the subsets, symbolic subsets that we can think of when we think of this computer that is the mind. And this organ, I'll say the symbolic organ that we choose to identify as the heart, but in the sense of definition, what I mean by this, when I see the word heart, is that it is a part of conscious experience. It is the seat of our feelings and our desires. It is held up by the pillars of creation because it participates in it. And because of this, because of the way in which it has come to be, it is afforded certain abilities, certain insights to feel, to understand, if it so chooses, some concept or ontological presentation that is consistent with the good. And another big concept there, that of the good, and how we trace that thread all the way back to the beginning. Now, I don't wish to come to any profound conclusion on this matter. I don't think I will be able to. But I do wish to proceed within this domain. And so there ought to be a little bit more said, I suppose, about what exactly this means. I mentioned that the heart it could be thought of as a tool, but it is more than a tool. It is a fundamental piece of our operating system. But it is more than just a fundamental piece of our operating system. It is an operating system that has emerged. Now, my language may be slightly incorrect here. That has emerged out of a larger conscious system. That it is related to this conscious system, the fact that the conscious system exists or pre-exists the agent that has come to be is a necessary condition for its being. The fact that this agent has these tools in some way mimics or in some way relates to that precursor operating system, and it is within that relationship that I think even the concept of the heart can find some sort of reality at all in conscious experience, even though it's not really physically a thing. It is, we could say this and that about the way that this is materially constructed, but it'll be vague at best. And the reason that it is vague is because its existence is really not dependent on any individual interaction. It is about the many interactions and the interrelatedness of these interactions. So it probably wouldn't provide us with very much meaning outside of differing ways to influence it, alter it. Now, what I mean to say here is that there is this exploration of mind from the physical point of view that I think only goes so far. There are certain productive avenues to explore with physical causality, but at a certain point we must make this transition in which what we speak of is less about a potential physical pathology, for example, and something that is of mind, something that is of experience, something that is of agency, something that produces value. And within the broader context, I have to imagine that whatever this life means, as I look at my flesh in front of me, that whatever this means for all of the honesty that I've had with myself throughout the years, the cherished moments, and all the wasted moments of lies that I have subjected myself to. In those more tender moments, in the more precious moments of reflection, again in honesty, this experience can seem melancholic. It could seem fantastic, confusing, purposeful, and purposeless. But I am still an agent in this world. I'm still experiencing. I'm still feeling. I'm still thinking. And while it may not last forever, in my current constitution, and while I may, as I've mentioned, fall into that nothingness of mind for want of comfort, to please something that I don't quite understand, given the possibility of mind, I think about where I'm going. I think about how tender the body is, how finite it is. And I think about the mind and how much there is within it to explore. And yet how much I feel as though I'm chained to something. I feel as though I am an orphan, a conscious orphan, that wishes to find his father again. Not that he doesn't believe that his father is not out there, but because he believes or he wishes that strong, fundamental love and relationship is out there to be experienced. But of course he knows that there's a certain responsibility involved in creating that experience. But that is the very thing. It is the creation of that experience. It is the very creation that is the bedrock of his heart and of his broader experience. And so by exercising it himself, he finds his way into into the graces of God, of the Father. But if we imagine for a moment this domain in which we can attribute certain material descriptors to that, what exactly would we say? Since there is a word that is used to describe the quality of something, perhaps the state of something. If something is hard, it is likely to be a solid. What of this relationship to creation, then? What adjective would we use? Well, perhaps it would be the opposite of hard. if we are to think that mischief is the antagonism to our desired goal, then surely what we would wish to change in this situation, he that hardens his heart shall fall into mischief. He that softens his heart shall rise into prosperity, into goodness, into love. Something along those lines. Of course, we would want the opposite of that statement. But just as we can find plenty of reasons why a hard heart may have some virtue behind it, and we can find many reasons why a soft heart may have many downsides to it, there's a way in which this verse is pointing us. A particular type of hardening, at a particular level, a particular contextual relationship. So if we are to flip this around and say soft instead of hard, that too must also find itself within that contextual relationship. So if we say something hardening of the heart in this context of broader creation that facilitates man's experience and connectedness to the Father, to a particular type of love and experience, potential that exists also within him, that he can create, that he can bring forth into this experience new life and new conscious agents, then soft in this situation means something quite particular. It doesn't necessarily mean weak. Quite the opposite. It means strong. But there's a way in which this softness, I think, has some material grounding that gives this reason. So if I take something soft, I take something that it is forgiving, it gives, that it is not completely resistant to my touch, and to my interaction with it. And given that this thing is not so repulsed by my interacting with it, means that it is more accepting of my interaction. And as we've discussed many times, the interaction among things is highly relational. It is dependent upon relationships. For anything to exist at all, there must be relationships. And the more forgiving a relationship, the more honest it is. Honest in the sense of that yielding of hardness, the yielding of certainty to a particular position, the openness to that which is true. Not openness for the sake of openness, but openness for the sake of truth. That it is because of that orientation, because of that interaction, that allows for the type of ontology, the type of experience, the type of production of the heart. That lends to truth itself, that lends to that which is right, correct. On the other hand, when we say something is hard, that it is impenetrable, that it is unyielding, it is not in the positive sense. It is not a virtue, though it can be in certain contexts. In this situation, it is unable to or unwilling to experience, unwilling to feel, And because it is unwilling to feel, it leaves itself closed to what there truly is, to that potential. And the question is, well, how exactly does this lead to mischief? How does this lead to a bad end? Of course, the insular, that which is void from anything outside coming to it, to influence it, to support it, to provide it, is completely gone. And so those things that are necessary for its own survival, to the maintenance of its identity, no longer exists, or no longer, rather, plays a pivotal role, or maybe not a pivotal role, but it no longer is valued as a pivotal component. And much like depriving somebody of oxygen, the situation becomes quite desperate. And I think in the broader spiritual sense, the behavior of somebody who's suffocating the self of their own identity, their behavior comes quite desperate as well. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. I'm going to continue next time, chapter 28, verse 15.